Thank you, Carl. Pleasure to be with each of you. And I have a deck that I'd like to walk through and kind of setting up the policy landscape for K-12 civic education. But as a starting place, I've had the privilege of sitting in on this conversation for the past couple of hours. And I'd like to just put forth the proposition that, one, some of the challenges that have been identified in these early sessions, to me, are symptomatic of a couple of generations of disinvestment and marginalization of civic education. And that, frankly, the most promising long-term solution to the problems that plague our democracy are reinvesting in innovative and equitable K-12 civic education. And just one quick example of that, something that I've privileged throughout my career as an educator is asking students to lean into conversations about tough issues, about difficult issues. And one thing we know from the research, and I know there are experts that were on the call previously that can speak to this with more authority than me, but the research suggests that for the most part, we don't talk about political issues with people who we disagree with. So the extent to which those conversations happen, they happen in a space where we tend to agree with people, and that has the effect of, frankly, amplifying our views. Why is that point important? Well, schools are actually a much different place where research suggests even in very red places or very blue places, a classroom is actually quite ideologically diverse among students. And number two, many of those students are still forming their views with respect to politics and the issues of the day. Three, you have an educator who has the capacity to facilitate these conversations and, frankly, teach students to have these conversations across difference in a civil way to build civic friendship, as has been exemplified on this call throughout the day. So that's just kind of one early example of how investing in civic education can help bridge that divide. So with that, I'd like to go to the slides. Thank you. And just as an introduction on the next slide, what I'd like to talk about is, one, kind of building on these introductory comments, the need for stronger K-12 civic education. Talk about a coalition that I help lead called CivXNow. Get into very briefly what's happening at the federal level, because it hopefully will have a lot of impact of what happens at the state level, but spend the bulk of my time talking about state policy, and then ending with just a plug for a policy summit that we're having for policymakers. It's our inaugural policy summit in September. So that's the agenda. Next slide. So the need for stronger civic education, next slide. You've seen these studies that suggest that civic knowledge is poor. This isn't a new headline, but quite stunning. In fact, this graphic here from the Annenberg annual study of constitutional knowledge, the headline was actually that half of Americans actually could name all three branches, but the downside, almost a quarter of Americans can't name any of them. So only half of America, three branches of government. On to the next slide. That's just one data point. And as has been suggested throughout this call, and you can come up with all kinds of scary graphs of this nature, Danielle Allen said in her opening remarks that congressional approval reached 9% at some point, but you see these long-term trends where trust in government, particularly the executive and legislative branch, and this is just at the federal level, someone else suggested these numbers, we're starting to see these at the state and local level. Trust in government is incredibly low. Next slide. And political polarization, of course, is rampant. This is a slide that I often share with my students, and it's kind of crazy to me to think that the mid-90s were the good old days when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich were at each other's throats, where political polarization was nothing compared to what it is now. So as you look at 1994 on the position of the median Democrat and the median Republican, and the fact that most of us, the bulk of us, had mixed views, there was ground for political compromise. And the most recent time that Pew looked at this data, 2017, look at that separation between the median Democrat, the median Republican, and the much smaller, where those of us have mixed views on the issues of the day. So opportunities for compromise are quite limited in this landscape. We think investments in civic education, as I suggested at the top, can help address some of these issues. Next slide. And so these trends, as I suggested at the top, correlate with this generational marginalization of civic education in schools. We can quantify this, so there's less class time devoted to the social studies and civics specifically. And if you actually go back a couple of generations, it was pretty typical for there to be 3 civics courses in high school. So you would have the standard American government course, which is mostly the norm across the United States. All but 8 states have some type of graduation requirement. But also have a class on civics, which was much more focused on state and local government. Most of our civics classes don't cover that at all. I would suggest that's the most important thing, and I would assume that would resonate with many of you. And then there was a third course, and it was often called Problems of American Democracy, which focused on current issues and having discussions about those issues. So we've scaled that back tremendously, and the real gutting of social studies and civic education has happened in the K-8 space, where standardized testing has really narrowed the curriculum. Predominantly, we're talking about reading and math, to a lesser extent science, but squeeze social studies out, I think, with detrimental effects to our democracy. Next slide. So we've done the math, and at the federal level, just to give you a pretty stark comparison, right now, the federal government invests a nickel per student, per K-12 student in civic education, whereas they invest $54 per student for STEM. So that disparity is vast, and it speaks to the marginalization of civics and social studies. Next slide, please. And shocking then that student performance on national assessments of educational progress in civics and American history are waning across several iterations of this test. In fact, speaks to even further to the marginal subject. Congress has actually cut funding for testing of civics in 4th grade and 12th grade. So the last 2 times NAEP has been administered just for 8th grade, but the most recent results for 2018, fewer than a quarter of students tested proficient in civics. It was actually worse than that for American history. And of course, huge gaps with respect to race and ethnicity. This isn't an accident either. Some of my research has focused on civic education inputs. And as you would expect, they are unequal. So we're investing much more in white and Asian students in terms of best practices in civics than we are in Hispanic and Black students. Next slide. Good news here. I always want to come back to that. We've actually done some polling on this issue, and I'm going to come back to a couple other more recent insights. But last year, Frank Luntz, Republican pollster, surveyed 1,000 likely voters. And civics is actually the most promising bipartisan solution to what ails our democracy. So you see other options like national service, getting money out of politics, making it easier to vote, where there's some support for those, but they're actually much more partisan splits. Whereas support for civic education was even at 56% between both Republicans and Democrats. So once again, the most promising solution to the various challenges that have been surfaced on this Civic Health Committee. Next slide, please. So a bit about the CivXNow Coalition. We are a project of iCivics. I assume many of you have heard of iCivics. This is the organization that former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor founded 12 years ago. And she was deeply concerned about the state of civic knowledge in the country and made this contention that we don't pass civic knowledge and respect for our institute gene pool, that each generation needs to learn them. This organization, she also recognized that her grandkids had an affinity for video games. So iCivics was born as a civic education education organization that teaches civics through online gaming. We also have a complementary curriculum. 12 years later, we become the leading organization in the country. We're about half of all middle school and high school students in the country use our resources. And because of that position, and because really the field of civic education needed leadership, needed coordination, we launched the CivXNow Coalition a few years back, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about on the next slide. We are a national coalition. We have right now 169 organizational memberships, are cross-ideological. They span the vast country, and we are united in pursuit of stronger K-12 civic education policies. The screenshot here just shows you our organizational affiliates start with the letter A. So it's a vast group, and we continue to grow that and divert. Next slide. And what we're really trying to do, as I said, the field of civic education, which is my introduction, made clear. I've been in my whole career in one way or another, and it's fair to say that we've long been pretty disorganized and certainly undercapitalized, underinvested. And what we're doing through this coalition is aggregating many of the good networks that do exist. We're developing policies, we're supporting state coalitions, which I'll come to in a bit, and lobbying directly for K-12 civics. So you see some of the various features up here. I'm going to talk in a little bit about a state policy menu that we've developed. I'm going to talk about a piece of legislation before Congress right now, which I think has a lot of promise for states. We have tables for both state policy and federal policy, lots of speaking engagements like this. And as I said, a limited amount of lobbying in particular on this federal bill in Congress right now. Next slide, please. In the theory here, our theory of change is that if we can strengthen both federal and state policies, create more demand, one in the form of schools to teach more civics, this will create more demand for both civics programming in schools and also teacher professional development, which is so critical to improving teaching and learning and practice in the classroom. And as these resources are put forth and implemented, as professional development improves teaching practice, we will foster young people's civic development. And by that, we mean their civic knowledge, their skills, but also their attitudes and behaviors. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I want to point to a piece of legislation called the Civic Secures Democracy Act slide, which is a next slide, please. Which is a bipartisan, next slide. Which is a bipartisan billion-dollar federal bill, which would make a transformational investment in civics education in the country. Remember when I said 5 cents a kid for civics, $54 a kid for STEM? This would get us to $18 a kid for civics. So that would be a transformational investment, investing in both teaching American history and civics, protecting the health, so critical for this group of our constitutional democracy, making sure that access to history and civics is equitable, and empowering students to participate in our democracy lives. Next slide, some of the details of the bill. It's a bipartisan bill, bicameral bill. So you see we have Representatives DeLauro, Cole, and Blumenauer on the House side, and Senators Coons and Cornyn on the Senate side. This is by and large a funding bill. It's very respective of federalism, which I'm sure many of you will appreciate. Most of the funding represents grants to states, and states then would pass through this funding to local education agencies. The one stick here is that states have to sign on to an expanded national assessment of educational progress in civics and history that will be funded by Congress. So it's not a new expense for states. And as most of you know, NAEP, of course, is just a diagnostic test. So it's not a high stakes test, and it's just administered to a sample of students. So this isn't some new statewide test. There's also nonprofit organizations through competitive grants. There's a strategic development component for teachers, partly through grants to higher education institutions. 35% of those funds work with Black colleges and universities and other minority serving institutions. There's also something I'm very excited about in my introduction is mentioned that I benefited from a teaching fellowship called the James Madison Fellowship. This would be a parallel program called the Prince Hall Fellowship that would focus specifically on recruiting students of color into the teaching profession. As many of you know, the teaching profession is not reflective at all of our ever diverse student body. Something like 83% of teachers are white, and social studies teachers are actually even less representative. So this fellowship, I think, is very important to address that issue. The strong data infrastructure here, where projects need to be evaluated, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. We'd update the framework and I administer it every other year instead of every 4 years in 4th, 8th, and 12th graders. And as states sign on, we'd actually have data that we can aggregate by state. There's a research component and actually the Madison Fellowship, which is a fellowship for one teacher in each state in the country, would have its strengthened. And the Truman Fellowship, which many of you may have benefited from, is a fellowship for students entering public service. So both of those endowments would be strengthened. Next slide, please. We're pursuing a multi-pronged strategy to advocate for this grassroots activation of our members. As I said, we have a federal policy task force where we're grass tops outreach, managing this bill, and then lots of community support in the form of things like op-eds, Facebook ads, like you see on the right, social media messaging. Next slide, please. Have lots of great grassroots support. So we have teacher networks at iCivics, the Madison Fellows in the bottom corner of the screen, but also partnering with great organizations like the Girl Scouts, which has a civic engagement badge now, YMCA Youth and Government, which of course has a 50-state presence. So a really strong grassroots network here of teachers and students making the case for civics. I can't think of anything more than that. Next slide, please. Elephant in the room, perhaps, and this came up, I know, in the previous conversation on the county, but there obviously is a very fierce debate happening in the country right now about critical race theory, which arguably has been misapplied, but nonetheless a fierce debate about it. There were federal guidelines that were released with respect to a grant program, a small grant program for civics and American history that invoked the New York Times 1619 project and scholar Ibrahim Kendi that of course ignited a firestorm. This is obviously happening in states, cities and counties across the country, as you all know well, but it's made the terrain very difficult for our federal bill and put pressure on our Republican sponsors to abandon it. They have held strong, so I'm really proud of that, pushing our way through this, and I'll come back to that later on. Next slide, please. We're lucky to have some high-level Republican support. We have some op-eds that have been published in favor of this. You see one here from Orrin Hatch that makes a strong case for this federal legislation, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. And just to give you an indication of the strong support for this bill, we partner with an organization called ActiVote, and really interesting organization, but they featured civic education in this bill over the course of 8 days and tried to get a sense of support amongst their users for the bill. And it was quite strong. 73% of respondents, almost 1,000 respondents, suggested they support the bill, and you can see their support across party lines, massive support with independents. So really proud and was excited to see this. Next slide, please. To state policy, but our goal with this federal bill, which obviously would be super important to what's happening at the state level, is to pass this bill with bipartisan support in the current Congress. So on to state policy. Next slide, please. and next one after that. Thank you. So we have a state CivXNow Policy Taskforce that convenes monthly, and it's emerged as a community of practice. We now have representation from 34 states. If your state isn't on there, we'd love for your state to be represented. So I'll put my email in the chat later on, and would love to connect with you and find a way to have your state represented. But 34 states, we're growing. My goal is to get to 50 by the end of next year. Next slide, please. And we surveyed task force members earlier this year to get a sense of what is in the way, what's getting in the way of stronger civic education in states. And the number one response, as you can see up here, mind you, these results are December of last year through February of this year, but it is competing standards and assessments and other subject areas, limited civics requirements, by far and away was identified as the biggest challenge. Second one was the need for teacher professional development. And I can tell you, as someone who used to fund this, the biggest challenge there is funding. So dedicated funding for teacher professional development. The third one, not surprising, and I'm sure this would be a much higher number of states in the current climate that we're in, but concerns about indoctrination in schools, suspicion of any type of experiential learning, and the political polarization that we're all trying to navigate. And the last one, funding for implementation. Next slide, please. So we have put forth a policy menu, published first time in 2019. I'm actually in the process of revising it right now. But these provisions are adaptable, obviously, to local context. So that's all it is a menu states can draw upon as they seek to strengthen civic education. And the most important one, I think, and maybe obvious, is universal, equitable access to high quality civic learning experiences. Often that's the form of dedicated standalone classes. For example, only 9 states in the country have a year-long civics class. So we're up to 42 states now that have a class, which is great. So that means 8 don't, but only 9 have it for an entire year. Also need middle school courses. About half of states have done that now. I'm proud that Illinois is one of those, and to be part of that effort. Indiana and New Jersey just created classes in the last legislative session, which was a big win. And then even dedicated time for civics and social studies in K-5. Civics needs to be centered in state standards. It is in most, but there's still some work to do there. It should be assessed, not necessarily in a bubble test, but assessment embedded within classes. Project-based learning is an important form of assessment. And of course, schools need to be held accountable for what they're doing with respect to civics. There needs to be pre-service and in-service professional development opportunities. Schools and communities need to make commitments to civic learning and be recognized for those commitments. And maybe most critically, we have a number of strong policies in states. Often the disjuncture here is that implementation isn't adequately resourced. I spent the last 6 years of my life in Illinois making sure that policies were successfully resourced. And I can tell you that is maybe the most critical thing that states can do. Next slide, please. So this spring, there were nearly 90 bills relating to in at least 34 state legislatures, and some of them drew directly from our policy menu. Next slide, please. We made some significant policy progress this spring. Next slide, please. Thank you. And I highlight a few of these here, but Colorado strengthened their civics content standards. I mentioned Indiana and New Jersey both put middle school requirements in place, and Oregon just joined the group of 41 other states with a civics course requirement. Also, as alluded to in the Federal Register controversy, this issue is playing out in states over so-called divisive concepts, or quote unquote critical race theory. And by our count, this is a map from Chalkbeat, but we have legislation, executive orders, state administrative agencies taking action with respect to these issues in at least 26 states. And so far, that hasn't shown any signs of abating. By our count, at least 7 states have enacted laws or policies impacting this issue. We don't know where this all goes. The issue has certainly been coupled with civic education, maybe unfairly so, but there are states like Texas, for example, where the bill that was signed into law there doesn't just tackle so-called divisive concepts, but also limits things like current events discussions in schools, limits experiential learning in civics. So our issues indeed have been coupled. And you may have seen a bill that went down narrowly in Arizona that I thought was the most extreme, in fining teachers $5,000 for delving into controversial issues discussions. So it's, as I've said previously, the best of times and the worst of times for civics with respect to the fact that we're in the national spotlight, but there are clearly some actions happening both at the national level, at the state level, and even at the local level, as was reported earlier, that I think are detrimental to good civic education. Next slide, please. Back to polling from ActiVote, I mentioned that only 9 states have a full year of civics as a requirement. There's actually very strong support, and this was once again amongst poll respondents, for a full year of civics. So I believe if you do the math, over about 83% support a full year of civics in our schools. So we have some work to do at the state legislative level, and a plurality of respondents support a volunteering requirement, a project-based requirement, and even an end of course exam. In fact, across the country, a requirement that students pass the citizenship test has passed in a number of state legislatures. So strong support for doing more. That's the takeaway I'll have here. Next slide, please. As I wrap up, I just want to put a plug in, and I look forward to your questions and the conversation that follows. Next slide, please. We are hosting, as I said at the top, our inaugural State Policy Summit, State and Federal Policy Summit. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the summit will be held September 21st and 22nd. And we'll have several components. We'll have a panel of governors. We'll have a federal update. In fact, Representative Rosa DeLauro plans to speak and talk about the bill that she's co-sponsoring in Congress. We'll have a panel of state chief state school officers, a panel of state legislators, and there it is, a panel on the role of philanthropy. So asking you to save the date for those. They're both half-day sessions. You see the time on the screen, and we're going to make registration available in the middle of next month. And we've been in deep conversation with CSG about this, so we'll make sure that this opportunity is shared with each of you and ask that you promote it within your networks. Ideally, we'll have very robust attendance, celebrate a lot of the great accomplishments that I highlighted earlier. Also use this as a catalytic moment for a very robust 2022 spring session and beyond. So with that, that's my presentation. Really appreciative of the opportunity and your time. And once again, happy to answer any questions you may have.